Today, we will continue with our arguments regarding the contribution of immigrants to the British society. And last time we talked about First World War and the way Indians and other colonies people fought during that war, that World War. And today we shall continue. This is part two. Today, Indians, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Gurkhas, as well as other people from other British colonies, constitute the vast majority of immigrants in the UK. Among these colonies, India's role was significant during World War One. According to the BBC, one of the reports of the BBC in Europe, Indian soldiers were among the first victims who suffered the horrors of the trenches. It was Indian Jawans, junior officers, who stopped the German advance at Ypres in the autumn of 1914, while the British were still recruiting and training their forces. Many Asians bemoan the attitude of British politicians and the media that don't highlight these sacrifices in an effective way. Shashi Tharoor, who is an Indian politician and author as well, laments that history has mostly forgotten these sacrifices. During World War II, 2.5 million Indians, 334,000 South Africans, both white and black, 320,000 East Africans, that's a huge number, and 200,000 West Africans, and 16,000 Caribbean fought for the UK. So if we put these all numbers together, it's 200,000, it's almost 3 million people just from India or Indian subcontinent, East Africans, and West Africa and Caribbean, just a few regions. Indian troops made a huge contribution to the war effort, winning 30 Victoria Crosses. As many as 87,000 Indian soldiers were killed. Gurkha's troops fought in Italy, Greece, North Africa, the Far East, and other places. Over 111,000 soldiers served across 40 different battalions, with 30,000 either killed or wounded. Gurkha soldiers won 12 Victoria Cross medals. Some historians offer a higher number of Gurkhas. For instance, according to the St. George Woolwich website, over 132,000 Gurkhas served with the Allied forces during World War II and were awarded 2,334 bravery decorations. So, Gurkhas are considered sort of martial race, and they are mainly based uh, in Nepal, and they are like warlike people, and they contributed to British Army during the colonial time, and some even afterwards. Many Indians and other immigrants also played an important role in the reconstruction of the country. For instance, according to Linda McDowell, a human geographer at Oxford University, the UK was facing labor shortages after World War II. Quote, the total working population had fallen by 1.38 million between mid 1945 and the end of 1946, as many married women and other people who had a delayed retirement left the jobs they had filled in the war. People were also leaving the country. Uh, Again, this is also quote, in the latter 1940s and into the 1950s, many families immigrated to parts of what was then known as the old Commonwealth, including Australia, New Zealand, Canada, countries that were themselves short of labor and anxious to encourage white settlers from the United Kingdom in an effort to maintain their old colonial links and European nations' notions of citizenships and identity. As these territories were recruiters rather than sources of white British workers, attention turned to citizens of new Commonwealth countries, especially in the early post war years, residents in the Caribbean as a potential source of new employees. So, this indicates that even during the Reconstruction, immigrants were there to help out the country. The author continues. The migration of colonial citizens began slowly from 1948 when the Empire Windrush arrived until 1952. Between 1,000 and 2,000 people entered British each year, followed by a steady and rapid rise until 1957 when 42,000 migrants from the new Commonwealth, mainly from the Caribbean, entered. The numbers declined by almost a half in the two succeeding years, but by 1960 had increased again to 58,000, and then in 1961 more than doubled in anticipation of the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act that would restrict opportunities for entry. Uh, the writer goes on to add, by 1961, according to the National Population Census, the number of people living in England and Wales who were born in the Caribbean was just over 161,000, 90,000 men, and just over 71,000 women. The most common sectors in which people from the Caribbean found jobs included for men manufacturing and construction, as well as public transport. Many Caribbean women found employment in the NHS as nurses and nursing aides, and as well as in public transport and in manufacturing, especially in the growing white goods industries in cities. Besides killing 450,700 Britons, World War II had also caused massive destruction. For instance, the German Air Force dropped thousands of bombs on London from 1939 to 1945, killing almost 30,000 people. More than 70,000 buildings were completely demolished, and another 1.7 million were damaged in London, while 200,000 homes were completely destroyed across the country. Amidst all this destruction, shortage of manpower, tens of thousands or possibly hundreds of thousands white British decided to leave, migrating to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. So the question is natural that who could have filled the vacuum that was created because of this migration of the white British to old Commonwealth, Australia, uh, Canada, and New Zealand. Now, the question is that could the post war reconstruction have been possible without the contribution of immigrants who toiled in labor intensive sectors rebuilding the shattered country? It was not illegal immigrants coming in droves to take away jobs, but the policy of the British government that paved the way for migration, which would not have been the case if the country hadn't been in dire need of manpower. The 1948 British Nationality Act said that all Commonwealth citizens could have British passports and work in the UK. Many of the earliest arrivals were from the West Indies, South Asia, and Cyprus. What prompted the government to come up with a plan aimed at encouraging immigration? It is claimed that the UK had a severe labor shortage after World War II, especially in the transport network and the newly created National Health Services. Given that large areas of the main cities had been destroyed by aerial bombing, uh, it prompted the government to launch a program of rebuilding which needed workers. It is asserted that the British policies were partly responsible for the violent partition of India and Pakistan, the civil war in Cyprus, and the underdevelopment of the Caribbean economy, creating massive unemployment there. These all factors also fueled immigration. It may be true to say that thousands or possibly tens of thousands of immigrants entered the UK illegally over the decades, but the far right creates an impression that all immigrants come to the UK illegally, that too on false pretenses. In reality, a significant number of them were either brought here or forced to leave their countries to flee persecution or find protection. For instance, the first batches of black Africans were not illegal immigrants, but they were brought as slaves. According to Migration Watch, a research institute focusing on migration from the 1650s, the numbers of Africans brought to the British Isles began to increase markedly by the late 18th century. Tens of thousands of people of African descent lived in Britain. Quote, most estimates range between 10,000 and 20,000, with some outlying estimates of 30,000. Some have estimated 14,000 to 20,000 for London alone in the 18th century out of a total population of 675,000. It is claimed that the UK had only 6,000 Jews in 1735, but pogroms, persecution, and discrimination forced the community to seek shelter, raising its population to 400,000 by 1940s. So it's very clear that a large number of Jews came here to avoid persecution. It seems that the migration from Eastern Europe was also fueled by wars and conflicts. According to the 1901 census, there were only 82,844 Eastern Europeans in Britain, but their population witnessed a phenomenal surge during and after two world wars. Migration Watch says during World War II, hundreds of thousands of Poles were stationed in Britain, and the Polish Resettlement Act of 1947 offered citizenships to 200,000 Polish soldiers who did not wish to return to Soviet dominated Poland. Quote, the 1951 census subsequently recorded 162,339 Poles living in Britain. After the Second World War, quite large number of other Eastern Europeans were allowed to settle in Britain. So we can see that it was wars, conflicts, and persecution that in reality prompted people to migrate to this country. Naturally, some Eastern European people had also fought in the areas falling under the jurisdiction of the UK or in UK itself. So that's why they opted to stay in this country instead of going to the areas that were dominated by the Soviet Union. And for this, we need to keep the context of Cold War in mind as well. So that was part two, and I will come up with part three.